Hello and welcome to this Let's Level Design tutorial series. Over the course of these videos, we will cover the basics of Photoshop, how to create a paper map, and pre-production and documentation, as well as the basics of Unreal Engine 4. For today's video, we're going to start with Photoshop and creating a paper map. And at any point during the series, if you don't find these videos helpful, I'd always suggest going to Unreal's YouTube page. They have excellent tutorials on how to work inside of Unreal Editor 4, as well as Matthew Markwitz's tutorial series on paper maps and general design and art tutorials. Now, to get started, I'd like to talk about the point behind paper maps and why they're useful, and why you should make them if you want to create levels or mods for a game. Now, in general, paper maps, they're not for you, the content creator. They're for everyone else on your team or your bosses, because hopefully you're either doing this for yourself or you want to actually get a job inside of the gaming industry. But in order to do that, you need to follow some guidelines like creating paper maps and documentation to show to the higher-ups inside of your studio to get the approval. So that's why you always want to start with paper map and pre-production documentation, so they can see kind of what your level is going to look like, whether they can improve it, or they could say, no, change X, Y, and Z. So here we see my paper map for my Capture the Flag level called Los Malditos. And I think this is the best paper map that I've done to date. And I have several other examples on my portfolio website, which you can check out at derekcinix.com. However, I wanted to show this because this is a completely finished paper map. You'll see some elements like we have some coloring, there's blocking off of areas. You can see all icons for different things, which are all laid out in our handy dandy key at the bottom of the paper map. Your key doesn't have to be at the bottom, it can be anywhere on your paper map, but just helps the viewer kind of see what's going on. But even without this, you can kind of see some of the flow of the level. You can see that there's two bases, and you can see that there's varying elevation in the map due to the coloring that I created on here. But still not the best. Could always be better. And for example, this is one of the best paper maps that I've seen as far as simplicity's sake. It doesn't have to be out of control and amazing. You just need to have an idea of what your map's going to look, because when we're actually in the editor, things will change. You'll edit things, you can get feedback. But as you can tell, like this person added shadowing to their paper map and topography. Well, there's not a whole lot of context for this map. Like, there's no items. I'm not sure if this is a deathmatch, single player, what kind of game is going on with this. However, you get an idea of what the overall map's going to look like. Presumably, you can get up into this 3-story sniper tower, even though they're going to be staircases, ladders, what have you. It's not super clear. But this is still a great example, because you can see the flow of it. You can tell the player can't go out into this gray area off to the side. Things are blocked out. You have to go up this ramp in order to get to this section of the map. And then you can hide down here or jump down possibly. Things of that nature. Now, another way that I've seen paper maps created are paper maps like this, and this is Call of Duty paper map. However, the caveat to this is, from what I can tell, this type of paper map, unless you're an amazing artist, you're probably not going to have the time or even necessarily need to add all the texturing into your paper map, when something like this or this will suffice. However, this looks much more professional. You can even use this as the minimap in-game, which I believe is the point of having the paper map like this. And I'm not going to cover how to do this type of paper map like with texturing and shadows and everything. But I want to improve on my own skills, so I'm going to try and work on this type of thing. But in order to do a paper map like this, one way I think you could do it, which is a little easier than trying to texture every single little thing, is if you created your entire level in the editor, you could take a screenshot of a bird's eye view of the actual map. So this is an editor view. If you're working in a game that has spectate mode, you could probably go into spectate and then free camera up into the sky and get a bird's eye view like this, and just take a screenshot, and then you can layer over it in Photoshop to add how this map has details for walls and staircases. However, that looks nice and that makes it a lot easier to have a really cool looking paper map, but it's not going to help you in the industry if you have to turn in a paper map in order to get your level approved, since taking the screenshot, that method requires you to actually have the finished level ahead of time. Let's get back to our paper map we're going to be doing today, which is for a deathmatch level, which I'm going to codename DM Temple. So the point is, it's supposed to look kind of like possibly an Egyptian temple type level, though I don't think there's the right assets in Unreal 4 exactly to make it look like an actual Egyptian temple. But the inspiration behind it are levels from like Perfect Dark and 007 GoldenEye, the temple levels from that. And I thought it would be a cool thing to bring into Unreal 4. So where I like to start is looking at real world representations of what a level might look like. So for instance, if you were in like a war zone in the Middle East, Google pictures, Google images, or search for images of war zones and towns and wherever location your level's set in. If you're making like a hotel level in Left 4 Dead, then Google floor plans for hotels, exterior shots, etc. So that's what I did with this temple. So I Googled first Egyptian temples, and I looked at some of the exteriors, and a lot of things will come up kind of like this image. So then I refined it down to Egyptian temple floor plan, and the floor plan that I really liked a lot was this. So this Unity temple. And I liked kind of the layout of this. We can definitely adapt this to some gameplay. And so that's where I started. And I did the most of the main floor already just to save on time, but I'll still show you some techniques of what I do when I create a paper map. However, if you want a full video of going through a paper map step by step, then you can check out my series in the StarCraft 2 editor, because I create the entire paper map for that level on video. So as you can see, it's not exactly the same as our reference photo, but it does have a lot of similarities, like the basic layout and shape is still pretty much the same. I condensed it because I didn't want the map to be super huge and out of control. And we're still left with these very large rooms and areas that I'm going to be adding cover to, static meshes, and geometry to later on. But for now, this is okay, because we can always edit things and tweak things as we go along. So it's okay, it doesn't have to be perfect. Now, you'll see these little lines over on the side. These are staircases to different sections, elevations of the map, second floor, or slightly lower than the main floor, or down to the basement. And right now I have them, they're just lines, which is kind of a universal symbol for a staircase. In order to create a staircase like that, one method you can do is click on the pencil tool or the brush tool. The brush tool will do lighter things, like you can see these lines, which I'll explain in a minute, those are made with the brush tool. These really dark solid lines were created using the pencil tool. So I'm going to select our pencil tool, and actually this is the same size again because I've been changing the pencil tool to work. So one way you can do it to create staircases, you select the pencil tool over on the left side inside of Photoshop. The shortcut is B in case you want to be super fancy and cool. And then you just left click, you hold it down, and then hold down Shift, and then just drag your mouse down. Or if we're making the sideways staircase, you'd click, hold down Shift, and just move it to the left or right. And what that does is it makes it so you only draw in a perfect horizontal or vertical line, left or right or up and down, depending on which way was your initial movement. So like now I can go left and right infinitely, but I can't go up and down. To undo, you hold down Control and hit Z. To go back more steps, because if you hit Control Z again, I'll just bring it back. Hold down Control Alt and hit Z, and then I'll go back multiple steps. In Photoshop, you're limited to how many steps back you can go. I forget exactly what it is off the top of my head, but it's like, I don't know, 10 maybe. But anyways, if you click, hold down Shift, and then you start going up and down, then that's what you're set to in your movement. So you can only go up and down vertically. You cannot go left and right on the horizontal axis, since that's how we started. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, you always want to click and then hold down Shift and move, because if you don't, what will happen is something like this. If you hold down Shift and then click, you'll get a diagonal line that goes down to wherever you clicked on afterwards, which can be useful if that's what you want to be creating, if you want to create diagonal lines like that. But we don't want to do that. So in this method, you click, hold down Shift, you drag, and then you do that over and over again to create staircases. Again, Control Z is your friend. And then Bob's your uncle. However, that can take a really long time. As you can see, look at all these staircases I have just in this half of the map alone. Not to mention all these over here and the ones we haven't created yet. So that can take a really, really long time. Another method that we can do, and by the way, I created a special layer in order to work on. You always want to create layers whenever you do anything. If you make a mistake, just like I did, I just deleted that. It was no big deal. It was just one section of it. If I had drawn that on our main layer, which I merged, which I'll go over later, on this one, layer 3 is our main layer, has our entire floor plan on it so far. If I created that on this layer, trying to delete it, I have to go into the eraser tool, and then I have to erase it, and it would take a lot more hassle. That's why you want to create different layers. Even the background's on its own layer, which I brought up before, having like a textures inside of your paper map, as opposed to the Los Malditos one, where it's just white, and then I colored each different section of elevation. One of the reasons why I chose to have a background here is because I wanted more flavor, and since I wanted it to be kind of an Egyptian temple sandy type map, I thought that would help in order to create that kind of atmosphere, even with just our paper map. And you can find tutorials on how to make your own textures like this, but I wanted to go quicker and not have to take a day in order to create this super cool textured background. So what I did was that I just went to Google image search, and then I searched for map textures, and this is the one that came up, and it's free, so that's why I decided to use it. You can go to the website, they probably have other ones, but it's real, it just makes it a lot easier. So back to our staircase. I created a new layer by hitting this little paper icon down at the bottom. So another way you can create a staircase is by using the pen tool, which the pen tool comes in handy for making lines and curves that look really, really nice. Because if you do, say, a curve by hand, it'll look pretty terrible. But if you use the pen tool to make a curve, which you just click in a spot, and then you click wherever you want the end of your line to go. This first dot will be the start of your line. Wherever you click after that will be the end. But you want to click and hold down the left mouse button, because if you hold it down, then you can move your mouse around and you can make this curve. And the line that shows up is what's going to be where the line gets drawn on your curve. Now you can also add in other points, but as you can see, things start to get more and more crazy as you add more points, because it only controls that one arc or one straight line depending on where you put your focal points. So Control C to go back. In order to now fill in this line, we go over to the paths. We have a working path, and that's what this curve is. Down at the bottom on this toolbar, you have a full circle, a circle that's empty, and then a dot circle. To fill it in, you click the open circle. Now, as you can see, that doesn't look very great. That's because we're still on the pen tool. So Control Z. To make it look nicer, I would suggest going to the brush tool. And now you have the brush tool selected. You can hit the left and right brackets to make it smaller and larger, respectively. So the left bracket makes it smaller, and the right bracket makes it larger. This applies whenever you're using any of the pencil or brush tools over here. So if I had pencil selected, it would do the same thing. Brush tool, as you can see with your eyes now, it makes it larger and smaller. So depending on how thick you want your line is what you'll set the size of your brush to. I usually prefer smaller lines. So out of 3, you can tell what size it is by up here in the top left corner, the size. You can also choose different brush shapes, but for our purposes, we only need circles because they make nice lines. So you click that, and now we have our nice curve. The brush tool does a better job of creating better looking lines because the pencil tool has square edges on it, whereas the brush tool is a perfect circle. Now this is pretty light because we use the brush tool. And to make it darker, you can just hit the stroke path with brush button over and over again, and it'll make it darker and darker and darker. Now, as we went over before, if you want to make another curve, you can't just click away. The best way that I found to do it, or the easiest way, is to just click on your work path and you delete it. And then you select your pen tool again if you haven't already, and then you just click again. And that's it. That's all you got to do. And you can also hold down Shift and then click, and it'll create a perfect line, which will come in handy if you're trying to do actual straight lines and you don't want to use the brush tool plus Shift, that kind of method, which is what I did do for our entire layout of our map. So if you don't trust your skills, like going too far or whatever, if you want your lines perfectly wherever, then I would suggest using the pen tool. And then to get back to our different layers, just click on the Layers tab. And since I drew this arc on a separate layer from the rest of our map, I'm just going to delete it. And then add a new layer. And you also see I have a folder created. You just create it by clicking the folder icon down at the bottom. And it creates a new group. And then you can just drag and drop your layers into it. and then they're part of that folder, and you can hide them and unhide them by clicking the eye. It makes it a lot easier. The reason I bring this up is because if you are creating separate layers for things, and then once we get into placing actual icons for weapons, etc., you'll have tons of layers, and it's just a better way to organize it because you can just collapse and expand it, and it'll look a lot nicer over in this viewport. So we've gone over using the pen tool to create lines, and in this instance, the staircase. We can do the same thing with the pen tool, which the shortcut hotkey in order to get to the pen tool is P. So we go over to our path, hit B to go back to our brush, and then we click on fill. And then what you can do, since we have the pen tool selected, is go up to, I think this is the move tool. I'm having trouble remembering what it's called. This is the Marquee Tool. You can select multiple objects, which is what I was thinking. But it's the move tool. You can click on the move tool, so now you have our awesome cursor. And you can click, and then you can drag this. And you have this perfect line, which if you just wanted to duplicate, you can hold down Alt, then click and move, and it duplicates it over and over and over again. What this will do is create separate layers, which is good, in order to merge them into one layer, so you don't have to mess with 15 layers of one object. You can click, hold down Shift, and then click the other end of the spectrum. So if this is the first one, this is the last one of the set, you can just click, hold Shift, and then click the last one. You can also hold down Control and click separate ones and deselect them. Very similar to how you would attach multiple files in, say, an attachment on email. Same kind of concept. And then in order to merge them, you right-click on any of the layers that are highlighted, and then you click on Merge Layers, and now they're merged into one layer, and they're all together. And then I'm going to delete this. So you can just create one and then copy it over and over and over again. You could also go through, use the pen tool to make it over and over again using the method of creating one line, deleting the path, creating the path again, deleting the path, etc. And then another way, you can create an icon such as the staircase and then use it over and over and over and over again, which may be the fastest way, or fastest method I know in order to do this, is you have your pencil tool selected. You do the first method, or I guess you could draw one line with the pen tool. As long as we have a line in our layer. So we have one line selected. What you would do is take either the Marquee Tool or the Lasso Tool. Lasso Tool allows you to set different points by clicking. If you have kind of a weird shape, that would be useful. And then you just connect it where you started. In order to get rid of this, you just click inside of it and you're good to go. Marquee Tool just selects in squares and rectangles. So what we would do is use our Marquee Select, select our one line that's on layer 4, not selected. We go up to Edit, and then what you can do is go down to Define Brush Preset. You click that, and now you can see over here on the left, we have our brush. Now, since I Marquee selected more than just the line, that'll show up in the brush as far as spacing is concerned between the lines that we'll draw. But now we're going to create a brush. So you click, you can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to leave it because I'm going to delete it in a second, but you click OK. Now if you go back to your brush, click the drop down arrow. I mentioned earlier there's different types of brushes. If you go down to the bottom, because by default it'll slap in whatever your last brush was that you created down at the bottom. And now we have our brush. That is our staircase. So I clicked on Marquee Select again and then clicked inside of it just to get rid of it. Because if you have a Marquee Select, it'll only draw inside of it. And we want to draw outside of it. So what you can do is you just click, hold down Shift, and then keep moving it. Now you have a whole bunch of them. Or you can just click over and over and over again. And now you have a staircase. Beautiful, right? And I like that. And we're going to leave it like that. So I'm going to save. And decancel because I just want to save it. First time you're saving, you should do save as. Or if you want to save it however you want, you click save as. So we're just going to do save. Now, the next thing that I want to do is merge these two layers because they look nice. And then I'm going to reset my brush to what it was. And then over here in what I would call the middle of the map, I've created on the main floor what will become holes that the player can drop down into, and that's why they're darker. And there's walkways that go across it. You'll notice that I left one uncolored over here, so we can talk about different ways you can fill in color inside of Photoshop. One way, which is the way I was doing it for these two objects, is you take our Marquee Select tool. You could do lasso if they weren't rectangles, but since they are rectangles, it's easier to just use the Marquee Select tool. You can zoom in and out on Photoshop by holding down Alt and then scrolling with the wheel. If you scroll in, like forward or up with the wheel, it'll zoom in. If you scroll back on the wheel, it'll zoom out. Another way you can zoom in is down here on the left above my timeline, which if you don't have the bridge open, you probably won't see. But at the bottom left, you'll see this percentage, and this is the percent zoom. So right now it's at 465.9% zoomed. And then just to scroll around, you can scroll up and down, just like you would in any other program, if you do not have the Alt key held down. So what we're going to do is hold down left click and continue to hold it down, and you drag it. And now you select the area we want to draw in. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have a selection created like this, you can only draw inside of that selection box. I'm going to also change to the brush tool because it comes up a little lighter on the canvas. And I mentioned earlier, if you push the right bracket key, you can make your brush larger. So you're going to do that in order to make it faster to fill this in. Because if we had set it to what I already had it would take a really long time to draw all this in. So just make it, you can make it as large as you want. We can just do this and then click once, boom, we're done. And as you can see, it only filled in the middle section that's actually selected with the Marquee tool. And I'm going to click again because the brush tool goes in lighter since I have the defaulted opacity as 50 up here. Oop. Gonna have to make it smaller. So over here, see the opacity is 50. By default, it should be 100, but I like to have my brush tool as 50 because it's like you're painting, you can mix things better and it'll blend better. But if I had set it to 100, then I would have just filled in like this in the beginning. Because we had 50% plus 50% equals 100%. Makes sense? So we have that. And as you can tell, it's the 100% still not as dark as our pencil tool. And then we're going to click the Marquee Select and then just deselect it again. And that's one way you can do it. Now I'm going to save since I like the way that looks. And you'll notice we're working on one layer, which is a no-no. I would suggest creating multiple layers whenever you do anything, as I mentioned earlier, but I trust myself. So we're just going to keep going. Now, as you can tell over here, I have some shapes that are created. The darker lines are created with the pencil tool. This lighter one is created with the brush tool. This is kind of to signify that there's going to be some geometry, but the player is going to be able to walk through here, as opposed to the pencil tool that I used, which is just a completely solid wall, and it's probably going to go from the floor to the ceiling, and the player's not going to be able to go through it. And as you can see, I have some of those right here. Then this is going to be a pillar in the engine. And we could just leave it as it is with it open like this, but I want it to look more like a pillar and less like some kind of box that might cause confusion. Someone was looking at this and trying to figure out what's going on in this. So, as I mentioned earlier, you could just make the tool really big. You could use the Marquee Select tool and just fill it in like that. Another way you could do it is come down here to the paint bucket, which those of you who are familiar with Microsoft Paint should probably know the paint bucket very well. And you can just click inside this area once and it just fills it in. And you can keep doing that with the pillars. So now I have some nice solid geometry. And our walls are filled in. And you can just do this for the entire map if you want to create pillars like that. Just to have like, squared walls or rounded off walls. This is a good idea. And as I'm doing this, you can see some of the imperfections that were put into the map when I was creating this earlier, which I will want to go back and fix. And you'll notice these pillars, I kind of like the way they look where they're open as opposed to closed. But since I've been working on one layer instead of creating multiple layers, I'm just going to keep going with it. And later I'll probably touch this up so that all the pillars are the same size, things like that, which would be a great thing to use the create a brush tool for. So they're all the exact same size instead of what I did, with was just use the pen tool and draw lines. Okay, so I can use paint bucket. The only caveat with this is that if you try and fill in something and you don't have your lines connected, like it filled in immediately just the part that I wanted filled in, so my lines were all connected and it was fine. But over here you can see that these lines are not connected to each other. So if I do that, it'll fill in my entire layer with black because it's open like that, except for these sections because lines are touching each other. So Control Z is your friend. So lines have to be touching, just like in Microsoft Paint, in order to use the paint bucket tool correctly. And then I'm going to fill that in because it's just going to be a solid wall. And then I talked earlier about the brush tool and how I have some of these lighter lines. What this is for, well, I put in lighter lines. I mentioned the players could walk through this. But this line up here, since it's next to the staircase, you can presume, and I'll add in some details later to make it more clear, that we can go up the staircase or down the staircase. And in our case, I think I'm going to make it so it's a staircase leading upwards. So this would lead up, and this would be a higher, this floor right here, this section of the map, of the level, would be at a slightly higher elevation than this room. So it blocks off this room from this room. And this would be slightly higher. And while this would be like a wall or the edge of the floor, it'd be kind of like if you like a stage of an auditorium where you can jump off of this or just walk off of it, as opposed to being a floor to ceiling wall like this back here. So the player could like walk up the staircase and then immediately turn around and come off here onto the staircase again, or jump off onto the floor below. And this doesn't necessarily have to be an entire story higher than this floor. It can just be slightly more elevated so the player doesn't take damage. Whatever your heart desires. And then over here, I mentioned that this is going to be a hole the player can fall into. And I'm going to make a basement section as well as a bridge that goes over the top of this, which is why I have this staircase over on the right and the staircase over on the left. The player is going to be able to go up this and then over the top of it. I'm going to have some cool looking geometry up there for this bridge. And I'll probably put something, a really good item on top of the bridge just because it's really exposed and there's only 2 ways to get to it so far. I might put in jump pads later. Who knows? Oh, and then this ledge you can jump down. Same thing with these ledges over here. All these ledges you could just jump through them. So it's meant to be a wall. It's not exactly a wall. Like you just go through, like this would be a staircase up and these would be staircases down. So they would be directly next to each other, like touching. So you could just walk off the upper staircase to go and then hop down onto the lower staircase and just keep moving to make the flow a little better in the map instead of having just walls everywhere and having to deal with that, even though in real life it would be a safety hazard to have that kind of staircase set up, but it makes for better gameplay in my opinion. Okay, so the reason a second ago I was talking about holes dropping down is I have some of these squares over on the side here that I'm also going to fill in because they will also be holes to drop down into the basement. Let me click twice to make it look nice. I probably also could have used the paint bucket and reduced the opacity to 50 or lower, depending on how what the tolerance is for the paint bucket, like how sharp the image is or like how sharp the color is when we drop it in. Okay. And then we need this hole also filled in because this is going to be drop down hole. And since our fill is going to be lighter than the solid wall, it's okay if you select into the wall because it's not going to hurt it at all. So there we go. And then what do I want to do next? Feel like next drawing in the upper floor, so like the bridge, and then this section and the top and the bottom of our paper map is also going to be split between being lower than this main room and higher than this ledge, and the higher part will be at the same elevation as our bridge across, so they'll go all together in the same folder / layer eventually. So we're gonna have that, and then that's why I have in this ledge line right here, so you can tell it's gonna be kind of split, and it'll make a little bit more sense once we add in some more elements, and then we see it in the editor. And you'll also notice right now, the far right side of our map doesn't look complete. It looks like we could go outside. Eventually it's going to be completely filled in, but I haven't 100% decided whether I want there to be the second floor up here, like up to the top, or to have more drop downs or staircases down to the bottom floor, because I haven't decided whether I want the bottom or basement level of this level to be as large as the top level. Probably not. So I haven't decided exactly what I want the layout to be. So that's why it looks incomplete for right now. And we're gonna just focus on the left side, which will still give you a good idea and tutorial of how to use Photoshop and how to go about creating your own paper map. Okay, now this video is going on for quite some time, so I am probably going to cut it off here When we come back, we're going to add in some of the second floor elements. But before we go, I also want to point out when you're creating the overall floor plan of your level, and you start out kind of what I did with just kind of the basic shape and outline of your map, you also want to be conscious of where you want to put player spawns. And it'll be a lot different whether this is a multiplayer map, what kind of multiplayer map, versus a single player map, and what kind of single player game that you're making. As I mentioned earlier, this is going to be a deathmatch level inside of Unreal Tournament 4. That being said, that's why we have some of these side areas which we can put player spawns in. I probably won't put items into these rooms, but I might. The only thing about these is that you'll notice there's only a one way in and out of these rooms, which is pretty detrimental to player flow and navigation inside of a map. You always want to have multiple routes for players to go, so they don't get camped, spawn camped, and to make sure they're not camping other players if you don't want players to camp. That's why if you notice in games like, again, I'm going to go back to Call of Duty, play the Call of Duty 4 map, Crossfire, there are two apartment type buildings. They're multi-floored, and they're really good for a sniper advantage. However, there's multiple ways that people can get into it, which makes it harder for people to just camp their all game and shoot at people. However, one of the apartment sniper nests is segmented into two different rooms in the top floor, and there's only one doorway into those two rooms, so players can still camp, but there's a lot of open area in the rest of that room. Like there's big windows, there's destroyed walls in the front, and so it doesn't provide as much cover from that way where they're going to be shooting out. So you gotta be mindful of all those little things for balancing your gameplay inside of your level. So I'm probably only going to put spawn points in these, as well as putting the spawn points back in here or over in this section, the top and the bottom sections. And depending what type of cover I can apply to this room and this ledge, I may put spawn points up here. However, if this is a capture the flag map, I'd probably just put the spawn points over at the top and bottom of sections of this map, and then put the flag up here on this ledge, and then do something different over on the right side of the map to make it a little bit more symmetrical. So just think about that. And then I'll probably put spawn points in this corner or that corner, and same thing on the other side, just because you'll be in the corner, and this gives the player two escape routes. They could just jump down the hole, or they could go out this way, or they could go up here. And then you could put like a spawn point in here because they have some cover, which is kind of the point of these rooms over here. You never want to have just a spawn point, like say in the middle of this room right here, right? Like if this was our map in the editor and there's nothing else in this room, this would be a terrible spot for a spawn point, because the player will spawn in, there's absolutely no cover, and if people figure it out, they can just sit somewhere and just launch rockets into that one spot to spawn camp someone. And the way spawning works in Unreal Tournament is that there's a couple seconds, then you gotta click in order to get back in, and it's kind of like your player kind of gets teleported in. So there's like a second or two delay when the player can really do anything. So that's why you want to put your spawn points be in places that have cover or several escape routes so they can run away. So hopefully I gave you guys a lot of things to think about and some of the more basic tools in Photoshop for creating a paper map. And then I will be going over some of the other more advanced tools when we get more into the finer details of it, such as adding our key and adding icons to things. And we'll be using a couple of these other tools over on the left. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Adios.